Welcome everyone to tonight's Daimler lecture. Welcome Tony and welcome Christine. We have very many reasons at the American Academy to be thankful to Daimler, but the most obvious and most important reason is the funding of the fellowship program by funding the Daimler Fellow, which is as such the whole fellowship program at the heart of this institution and its mission, and which enables us here at the Academy to bring the best and the brightest of Americans for one semester to Berlin. One example of this is Emily, and we are honored and beyond to have you here with us for this current spring semester. Emily comes to us from New York University, where she is Silver Professor for French and Comparative Literature. Here at the Academy, Emily does a lot of things, but first and foremost, Emily has been developing a political theory of translation that investigates what happens when we apply theories of justice to the translation practice, especially under conditions of violence, and Emily seeks to find a definition of translational injustice. The topic of tonight's lecture will be the translation, or rather the untranslatability, of the modern terminology of sexual safety, as both as a concept and in its legislative practice. Usually at this point I would say more about Emily's accomplishments and Emily's work, but I have now the honor to introduce a special guest tonight who will be doing exactly that. I warmly welcome Professor Eva Geulen, who is currently the director of the Leibniz Center for Literary and Cultural Research here in Berlin. Eva is also on the executive board of the Centers for Advanced Studies in the Humanities in Berlin, and she's a professor for European culture and the history of knowledge at the Institute for Cultural History and Theory at the Humboldt-Universität. She held research fellowships from the Mellon Foundation as well as the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. We are delighted that she's here with us tonight to introduce Emily, and she will also moderate, after Emily's talk, the following Q&A with the audience. Thank you for joining us. A very warm welcome to you.
Dear fellows of the American Academy, dear guests, and dear Emily. It is an honor to introduce Emily Apter, Silver Professor of French and Comparative Literature and Chair of the Conflict Department at New York University, where she has been teaching since leaving UCLA and the West Coast in 2002. It is an honor indeed, and it would also be a pleasure if I had enough time to introduce her properly. You just heard it. Emily does a lot of things. But the task, therefore, is daunting. Given that her CV approaches book length, what should I select? Which of the many publications should I mention? Which of the previous awards, honors, fellowships, and grants, Rockefeller and Guggenheim included? Which of the many institutional positions and offices she has held? Allow me then to cut things short and say just this. Emily Apter, force of nature, one-woman institution, fails to translate. To begin with, she fails to translate into the standard format of an introduction. However, Emily fails to translate. That deliciously duplicitous phrase should permit me, I hope, to at least gesture towards the breadth and reach of her scholarship as well as its unique profile. For the question of translation constitutes the very medium of her thinking and writing and will also play a significant role, you can tell by the title, in tonight's talk. Emily fails to translate means that her enormous accomplishments transcend not only the disciplinary boundaries of comparative literature, however generously conceived, but those of academia as well. Because her work is always an intervention in current political as well as social situations and debates. Much would get lost in translation if her insistent questioning of the world in academia and academic work in the world would be reduced to just scholarship. Emily's 2013 book Against World Literature, left little doubt about its interventionist character, as it successfully disrupted the comfort zone in which many proponents of world literature as the next new and better thing had settled. Similarly, tonight's talk also can be expected to cut to the heart of some very uncomfortable questions of our being in the world as culturally coded sexual beings. In all of her work, Emily confronts and raises difficult questions with fierce fearlessness, an admirably elegant style, and a great sense of humor. Emily fails to translate. Anybody familiar with her work will know how she does not want the failure of translation to be understood. It does not prove the existence of an ineffable quality beyond the reach of translation and perhaps language altogether. On the contrary, the ever new and different failures to translate teach us, so Emily believes and teaches us, something new about our own language and about the other language. Accordingly, to read the sentence, Emily fails to translate transitively in the sense that her own translations fail is not an insult, but in fact a compliment. And nobody knows that better than Emily herself, who together with other colleagues achieved the impossible with the translation of French philosopher Barbara Cassin's Vocabulaire européen des philosophies, dictionnaire des intraduisibles into English. The massive book appeared in 2014, a decade after Cassin's French original. Of course, the English title, Dictionary of Untranslatables, a philosophical lexicon, is in certain respects a translation failure, striking above all for its omission of the original reference to the European languages. By the same token, that very omission marks the translation of untranslatables as a transformation that opens the book to new uses and further translations in areas beyond the geographical or linguistic boundaries of Europe. To use Emily's own words, her translation achieved, I quote, the conversion of translation failure into something of value and interest, unquote. But I hasten to add that Emily also fails to translate into a particularly gifted translator or spectacular theorist of translation. For one, translation is not always and not only a matter of words and languages. The translation zone, to borrow a formulation from one of her earlier books, is much larger. For Emily, it encompasses, among other things, pictures, music, films, videos, as well as specific discourses and technical vocabularies. You will, I believe, hear some of that tonight. Before you can begin to translate anything, before failing and succeeding in translation, you need to identify the language at hand. In the case of most known languages, this is obviously easy, but it is far more complicated when you are dealing with a multifaceted and, as it were, multilingual phenomenon, for example, sexual safety. Much of Emily's work, I believe, is about identifying and exposing the various languages that have gone into constituting particular phenomena but are no longer recognizable on their surface. For her, all political and social phenomena are complex, often hidden, repressed, or ignored processes of translating and transferring, borrowing, importing, and refashioning. And it's those processes she seeks to bring to light. By the same token, familiarity with the composite, layered, and translational structure of what looks like a simple fact also explains her keen sensitivity to underestimated practices, so to speak, under the radar, especially in the realm of political theory. This is something she pursued in her most recent book on unexceptional politics. The incredible skill Emily possesses in recognizing and identifying untranslatables that have been translated into seemingly monolithic phenomena no longer in need or capable of translation has a flip side. For someone so attuned to the uniqueness of untranslatables, the world begins to echo and rhyme with translatability. I have often admired, and still do, Emily's ability to bring together in one lecture, one essay, one book, so many, many, many different texts, media, and voices. As for the question how Emily is able to absorb, remember, store, recall, and integrate such vast amounts of materials, past and present, near and far, high and low, I have no clue. It is Emily's secret. It fails to translate, and we are grateful for that. Please join me in welcoming Emily Apter.
If I flip this on, can everyone hear? Yes, thanks so much. Oh, thank you so much, Eva Goylan. You can, having just heard her, see why I so deeply admire her work and everything about her. Talk about a force of nature. So I'm tremendously grateful to you for introducing and for moderating this evening. Let me thank the Daimler family foundation for making my stay here possible. It's been an incredible stay. I really had no idea how taken up I would become in life here in Berlin and at the Academy with, first of all, fellow fellows, with people who have been guides. Berit Ebert, let me start by thanking you, the person who managed the organization of my particular talk, Caitlin Hahn, and all of the staff here at the Academy. And then there are so many people who have been involved in institutions. I landed here in early January at the HKW. I've had relationships now with people at the Institute of Critical Inquiry, the Freie Universität, die Fragt, Vico. The list goes on, but it's also just been the way people have reached out. I've met translators. It's become a kind of home in a very short time, and I really can't thank everyone enough, and also for being here tonight. So let me get started with a little text. It's from a poem, lyric text, I'm not sure what the genre is, by Claudia Rankine, called Citizen, an American Lyric. A body translates, it's you. You there, hey you, even as it loses the location of its mouth. The worst injury is feeling you don't belong so much to you. So, the language of sexual safety, rooted in norms of secured, defended personhood, is a patchwork discourse. It imports from sources as wide-ranging as contract law, property ownership and service agreements, workplace safety rules, disability infrastructure, environmental hazard and toxic waste regulations, gun control and military logistics, epidemiology, warning labels and disclaimers, mental health and wellness assessments, key to legal compensations for psychic and physical damages, and hazier notions of social proximity and distance, whether these are encroachments on body space to effective measures of non-consensual intimacy. My interest is not so much in mapping these tributaries, though to do so with some rigor and precision would be important, as in examining the effects of their convergence. How do the languages of gun control and Second Amendment rights, for example, cross into discourses of sexual self-defense? How does the term toxicity relate to gender? How do figurative expressions for spatial and environmental safety, themselves often at variance with each other, clash with psychic accounts of sexual triggering? As this vocabulary grows and circulates, producing new concepts and memes, it plays an outsized role, yet an underrecognized role in defining the contemporary micropolitics of the social. I mean by that new notions of prohibition and line crossing that not only redefine harm, offense, violence, trauma, and legal redress, but also the bounds of what is deemed readable, unwatchable, comic, no longer funny, unsafe. And you can see there are certain resonances here with discussions that I have been very aware of while here at the Academy, which are the link between the humanities and public policy debates and questions of the law. Now, Wendy Brown, an important political theorist, laid out some of these issues in her landmark book, States of Injury, Power and Freedom in Late Modernity, published in 1995. But in the 25 years that have elapsed since its publication, and in the context of the hashtag #MeToo, her notions of wounded attachments and psychic injury warrant revisiting within the contemporary politics of social relation. Let's start with an example with resonance in Germany. Political antagonism concerning sexual safety erupted into view at the moment of the so-called New Year's Eve assaults in Cologne and other German cities in 2016. Over 1,000 women were allegedly molested by men identified by police as Arab or North African in appearance. Cologne Mayor Henriette Recker put out a call to women to follow a code of conduct that stipulated staying at arm's length from strangers. In addition to highlighting how harassment committed by migrant or racially identified men feeds into ethnocratic narratives, this incident brought to the fore what might be called the problem of the too near, rarely taken up in theories of cosmopolitanism or claims for a unilateral right to hospitality. This is a too near defined by culturally coded, predominantly Western norms of sexual safety in institutional settings or public spaces. It relates to the liberal subject's perception of transgressed borders of property in the person, itself based on notions of sexual sovereignty that guarantee legal protection from non-consensual coercive sex. And I show you here the 9 Heist 9, the no means no, the sexual criminal law under Sexualstrafrecht, voted in 2016 as a measure of protection for sexual self-determination and hailed as a paradigm shift by the Frauen gegen Gewalt, the Women Against Power, BFF organization. And if Teresa Ulm is here, she's a lawyer I met at one of the dinners. She pointed me towards some of the interesting reporting on this case, on this law. Now, the New Year's Eve affair bears on the charged and ambivalent politics of border securitization. In Europe, where national belonging and the social compact have been historically sealed by the sanctity of whiteness, Christendom, legally enforced codes of conduct, uniform education, and sovereign borders, the too near poses a direct threat to cosmopolitan Europe, undermining its foundations from the Kantian ideal of perpetual peace to the Goethean aspiration of elective community or affinity. Now, the community of elective affinities, or to highlight another translation of the title of Goethe's 1809 novel, Die Wahlverwandtschaften, and that was Community of Kindred by Choice, which is another alternative title, translation. This implies a voluntarist ethic of what Roland Barthes characterized as the ideal of vivre ensemble, the will to live together, to be in kindred spiritual unity, to enter into contact, to authorize proximity to agree not to keep each other at arm's length. And yet, as we know, this is the cheesy American. And yet, as we know, measures of physical proximity and unbordered sociality are hardly universal, and free societies have countless ways of reproducing the siloing, corralling, and distancing of minorities in the name of risk management. As Sarah Ahmed notes, social exclusion is produced by, quote, atmospheric walls, subtle gatekeeping devices effective where actual walls fail. An atmospheric wall, she writes, is effective when the mood is so uncomfortable you decide to leave without anyone forcing you to, or when the stakes for participation are so prohibitive that you dare not enter the space, both invisible and selective. In the undesirable, it produces shame, guilt, and awkwardness. Now, current NYU student Smaran Dayal and a co-author Wanda Vrasti extend non-inclusivity to the forfeiture of what they call rightful presence. It's a very beautiful phrase. Rightful presence, they argue, is not about pursuing inclusion into an already established order. Rather, it seeks to assert a new measure of justice, even if that means undoing the order we currently exist in and benefit from. And that's the end of a quote. As the basis for positing this new measure of justice, they defer to Alfonso Lingus's, quote, community of those who have nothing in common, cast as another community, alternative to that of self-possessive and rational individuals, ready to open itself to the intruder and to the stranger. This other community is not realized in having or in producing something in common, but in exposing oneself to the one with whom one has nothing in common. This is community located in radical vulnerability, and a vulnerability that would seem to herald a commons or an undercommons that resists being computed as a threat by the risk economy. Sorry, that's very wordy. It won't all be like that. The question of what it means to be a citizen or non-citizen is the unsafe space of social harming and will anchor my conclusion. It is a major theme of Claudia Rankine's Citizen, which we just saw, a text whose address invokes a you, it's written as you, applicable to the narrator, to you, the reader, and society at large, intertwining these addresses in a web of co-responsibility for violence done to racial personhood. The collective fantasy of safety turns on an implicit and shaky promise that defensive infrastructures can protect you. Rankine asks, protect whom? Many of these social or physical structures are features of structural racism and misogyny, designed to fail to deliver security to members of certain communities. Rankine writes, and this is a very poetic statement, guardrail, safety lock, airbag, fire lane, slip guard, night watch, far into this day are the days this day was meant to take out of its way. For Michel Foucault, a life that is too safe risks losing the possibility of experiencing sex as a creative practice. The San Francisco bathhouses were, in his eyes, laboratories of sexual experimentation designed to emancipate pleasure through the eroticization of power, the eroticization, he writes, of strategic relations. For Foucault, interviewed in the heyday of the gay sexual revolution, creative sexual practice meant gender social equality and subjective freedom, almost like an extended care of the self. And while in hindsight, this blithe embrace of eroticized power relations seems out of joint with our current heightened awareness of inequities of gender, race, class, and zoned existence, it nonetheless highlights the difficulty of producing a stable understanding of embodied safety and sexual ethics. In the contemporary US, the concept of safety is historically tied to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, called OSHA, a relatively recent government institution established after congressional passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. OSHA does not, of course, offer a subjective accounting of how it feels or what it means to be in safety, but its statutes define unsafety in subtractive terms as the absence of hazard. Labor regulations extend the negative liberties of health and happiness, the right not to be harmed, the right not to suffer, to the spatial coordinates of a safe environment or a safe zone imagined as free of discrimination, harassment, aggression, and what you might call Angstlosigkeit, fear and anxiety. These rights, I would say, are inalienable, but they also default to culturally marked values of self-ownership and self-preservation, the latter characterized by Jane Elliott as, quote, the most impervious form of interest, based on a radically, this is her, unmediated relationship between individuals and their own single, irreplaceable living bodies, end of quote. So underlying contradictions between the need to defend moral and bodily integrity and Lockean traditions of what was called in political theory property in the person, these are, I would contend, part of what makes defining sexual safety both challenging and even traumatic. In approaching all of these issues, I've drawn on my background as a translation theorist, as someone deeply engaged with what I like to think of as political philology, a science of language, long a mainstay of the comparative humanities, that emphasizes the deep structures of language, the way cognates and cognition are entwined. As the denominations of sex and gender drift and mutate, as certain terms land globally and get retranslated, the ground of worldview shifts in ways that are both small and tectonic. And consider the term gender, rendered as genre in Romance languages. Genre in English denotes first and foremost a canon of art, music, and literature, a style or aesthetic manner. And this sense of the word interfered with the translation of Judith Butler's landmark Gender Trouble, first published in 1990. The book's French translation, Trouble dans le genre, literally trouble in genre, or prompts the question, what genre are you? In English, this sounds wrong, but in fact it may be the right question to ask, because it articulates a symptomatic naming trouble, or trouble in the house of gender, that speaks very much to the larger problem of gender's untranslatability. Unlike gender or the American idea of gender identity, genre brings out the connection to the root genus, sex, kind, species, being, foregrounded in the German Geschlecht, which encompasses the meanings of sex, gender, kin, human, species, human, or people. Ironically, as Geschlecht is edged out in Germany in favor of gender, as in Gender studieren in the place of Geschlecht studieren, critics outside Germany are turning to Geschlecht as a term that better navigates sexus und genus, the former inclusive of grammatical genders that don't coincide with sex, and we obviously think of das Mädchen. The latter inclusive of inanimate things, classifiable according to kind, but not to sex. Geschlecht is particularly well suited to contemporary debates over the intersectional regionalism of categories like human, animal, living thing, species, kind, or kinship. It also challenges the sex-gender divide as it has been politically manipulated in the American courts. Former Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, you may recall, ordered the Justice Department to take the position that transgender people are no longer protected by civil rights laws against workplace discrimination based on sex. His reasoning was this: the word sex only refers to biological male or female, so the Civil Rights Act would not ban discrimination based on gender identity. In this case, sex was split off from gender with the express aim of legalizing transgender discrimination, something that probably wouldn't have happened if the word had been Geschlecht. It's in what's been billed as the Epicene era of common pronouns. Facebook currently registers a menu of 71 self-identifying options, ranging across agender, cisgender, genderqueer, fluid. Here's one I'd never heard of: neutre, and trans, and there are 71 of them. The process of naming, claiming, and translating sex and gender has become crucially constitutive of the public sphere. Germany recently saw the controversial introduction of gender Sternchen. Sternchen is a star or an asterisk, where the star signals non-binarism. This orthography produces gender-neutral personal and professional designations like Freund, Sternchen in, and this gets attached to all the different professions. And if Liz, Liz is here, Pogorzelski-Wolf, my German teacher here, I thank her for many things in this paper, and this in particular. The asterisk is commonly used as shorthand for repeated items or sets of possible variants. So one could say it functions like an abbreviation for English indefinite pronouns that we use that are non-binaristic. One, someone, anyone, or the singular they in place of he, she. Newly minted personal nominatives like hier, sie, mix, and thon, or French initiatives to degenderize grammar through post-binary pronouns and dropped accords. And you see these are from various charts that I've been looking at. Gender stanchion in this lexicographically plastic frame arguably refers to all the ways of calling gender or any kind of sexed being. French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy devised his own grammatical construction in this spirit when he coined the term sexistence, sexistence, for a sexual ontology that conjugates itself in the verb to sexist, and it gets conjugated je sexiste, tu sexiste, il, elle sexiste, und so weiter. Untranslatability in the arena of sexual safety applies not only to the impact of incommensurate vocabularies of how to be in sex, and not only to the clash of competing metaphors of securable life drawn from nationally specific legislation pertaining to different kinds of safety regulation, but also to the problem of trying to conjugate sex and safety in the first place. How is sexuality governable, especially in light of the fact that by 2014, the U.S. Department of Education had officially abandoned the task of defining consent? Go through the law, and this is the case. They concluded no determination as to whether that element has been met is required for administration and enforcement of the Violence Against Women Act. How is American law, and more particularly Title IX, which is the legislating of harassment in campuses, in campus adjudication of harassment claims, conflated? How is this conflated sexual discrimination and sexual assault, two different orders of violence, as well as safe sex and safe space? And how do we define the norms of sexual contract in the social compact, absent a universal denomination or definition of sexual norms? The French revolutionary Saint-Just wrote what might just be the first sexual harassment code applied to modern citizenship. He told anyone who was over 60 and was okay. Anyone younger, they could be accused, and they had to wear little red scarves, and they were still dangerous. It turned on a universal value, though, and this is what's kind of interesting, of salut public, which literally is public health. And what comes to the fore in translating this term is the way in which subjective health is sutured, connected to an ideal of citizenship that puts sexual safety front and center. So already we're beginning to find this safety, health kind of connection in notions of citizenship in the French context. In the interest of thinking more deeply about what sexual safety is and how it defines political equality in the social contract, I'm now going to take three terms, I hope I have time, trigger, toxic, and safe space, and subject them to a kind of philological critique that brings out their untranslatability factor. Moving beyond commonplaces about how cultural difference is inscribed in language, my aim is to show how what is unthought or unheard in the circulation of this language of points to fundamental antagonisms between self-centric modes of governmentality and the right to self-determination and self-defense. So let me move to trigger. It goes without saying that the term trigger does not translate well across languages. French déclic, or avertissement de déclenchement, Spanish aviso de contenido, Italian avvertenza alerta prealarme, German Auslöser, Abzug. None make specific reference to sexual safety. And when they do, they fall back on English, as in the German Triggerwarnungen. Even in English, I want to show, the term is evolving and more complex than it seems. It serves as a placeholder for the agent of sexually violent acts, such as the offender, the predator, the rapist, or even the memory form of a violent encounter, which acts as a trigger. It operates as a direct reference to targeting, weaponization, or what might be thought of as the kill factor inhering in a decision, as in pulling the trigger. And it's a name for mechanisms of emotional liftoff or depressors. In the encomium of Helen, the Greek sophist Gorgias specifies that certain words function as bringers on of pleasure and takers off of pain. These bringers on and takers off conceptually ground the performative dimension of the trigger. It sets off and it sets itself off. Tautologically, it triggers triggering. In these ways and more, trigger articulates the nexus where a philosophy of violence meets the sexual politics of safety and self-defense. Now, I had a whole paragraph I don't have time for, and it was actually designed for Nadine Hartman. I will have to come back to it in another context, but it's on the whole question of the clench, the latch in Lacanian theory. So we'll for another day. But for now, let me move to something to a show which got me started thinking about some of these problems that took place in 2017 at the New Museum in New York, called Trigger: Gender as a Tool and a Weapon. The curator of that show, Joanna Burton, says, a trigger is a mechanism that with a little bit of force sets off a huge amount of potential reaction, both for better and for worse. Trigger, she says, invokes certain weaponized aspects of identity. That's a very interesting idea. Weaponized aspects of identity, as well as signals of material and of a sensitive nature, of material and of a sensitive nature. So, it's this weaponized aspect that is compelling, particularly a staged visual performative involving language. And this is from Adrian Piper's tiny little, it's called My Calling Card. Gorillas, what happened to my page? Uh-oh. What did happen to my page? Page 9 disappeared? Well, I can probably just out of order. Oh, maybe page 9 did disappear. Oh, no, here it is. Okay, all is not lost. Okay. So it's in the center of a white page, and it's a pop-out. Here, you have to imagine, you can't see it. It's just this little calling card. And on the other side, it says, Fassen Sie mich nicht, don't touch me, hands off. So you could say that, like a prophylactic or defense, the card seems to ward off violence even as it testifies to its routine occurrence. Piper's work could be situated in a long line of feminist self-defense pieces and of actions. This is a suffragette learning to basically struggle with a policeman at a demonstration in the early turn of the 20th century. These are 1982. These are feminists out there learning Krav Maga. I had great video clips of Krav Maga. This was an Israeli self-defense sort of more than a teaching, a form of a kind of a training of self to always win, and it's very carefully placed punches that economize where you hit. This is Louise Lawler's, Jenny Holzer's, I'm giving you a little historic selection here, Men Don't Protect You Anymore, from the Survival series, 83 to 85. And then I bring you up to Emma Sulkowitz's mattress performance, Carry That Weight, from 2014 to 15. And so you see how here, in each case, the trigger is in many ways appropriated through its functioning as a representational medium. Three intertwined lines of argument emerge here. The first concerns the status of the trigger as a volatile conceptual medium that puts the viewer on notice to increase their awareness of sexual violence and gender trauma in the social order, while at the same time appropriating the trigger as a weapon of self-defense. The second concerns the double coding of what is meant today by public safety, which tacks on one side oh God, did I do this again? I had to cut, so this is a little bit hair-raising, but I think I'll be okay. Let's just not panic. Yes. Okay, which tacks on one side to structural guarantors of safe space and safe conducts that could include trigger warnings, and on the other, to institutional technologies of surveillance and policing, often seen to intrude censorship and force of law into public and private existence. The third line of argument foregrounds sexual contract, which many contend rests on a juridically unstable, historically sexist terminology of consent, agreement, compliance, acquiescence, willing, agency, wanted and unwanted advances, freedom and coercion, body language versus oral affirmation of assent. Like citizenship, contract, as Carol Pateman observed in her landmark The Sexual Contract of 1988, is beset by the Wollstonecraft dilemma, the compromised condition of the feminist demand for political equality, whereby to demand citizenship necessitates submitting to patriarchal terms that de jure exclude feminist difference. Okay. And I would just say, before I go into the final phase, that what's emerging here is, you could say, out of this Pateman work, is a whole very significant field of feminist jurisprudence grounded in the defense of women and minorities, spanning the work. And I just give you a tiny list, but for those of you who work in this field, here's mine. Kate Pateman, Sylvia Federici, Giselle Halimi, Angela Davis, Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Williams, Janet Halley, and Drusilla Cornell. These are all people who are really grounded in the law. Supplementing Inroads Insecurity Studies, the politics of care and social suffering, and trauma work on survival and the reparative demands of survivors, this field resets the terms that have been historically heterosexist and posited as universally neutral. It sets the terms according to which positive legal determinations of sexual contract, consent, complaisance, and politeness, which code rapeable subjects or the weaker sex, these terms, according to which the terms that have been historically adjudicated. Now, following on and triggering once again, drawing again on language work, I want to think more carefully about how the terms trigger and trigger warning affirm a tension between involuntary will. If I'm triggered, it's because I can't control my reaction to the replay of a traumatic incident, and willed consent, recognized as the secure path of sex without trauma or non-triggering sexual relations. And I'll just mention here, for your consideration, how Georgia Southern University defined consent in its 2015 annual security report as voluntary, sober, imaginative, enthusiastic, creative, wanted, informed, mutual, honest, and verbal agreement. Okay, it's already difficult enough to parse willing and wanting, desiring and abstaining, giving and withholding, voluntas and noluntas in spoken and embodied languages. But now, as we can see, there's an increasing pressure to qualify and quantify veridiction and affective charge attaching to the expression of will. What constitutes the pivotal unit of expressive voluntarism? How are truth and enthusiasm of consent calculated and accounted for? These questions, connecting the metapragmatics of language to philosophies of action and will that reach past narrow consequentialism, beget still more questions. What connects force to the causation of harm, to the commission of harassment and physical violence, including war? How is safety from sexual violence secured alongside the right to exist freely in sex? How do we keep strategies of personal self-defense clear of militaristic, governmental, internationalist, zero-sum logics of security zones and security pacts? The last of these interrogatives resonates in the campus security debates over safe sex and the regulatory powers of Title IX. And again, if I had more time, I would go into some of those. Maybe we can come back to them. But I'm going to wind down with a briefer discussion of toxicity and safe space. Okay. As climate and environment acquire traction in the vocabulary of sexual safety, the use of toxicity has seen manifold increase. Declared the International Word of the Year in 2018 by the Oxford Dictionaries, where it competed against gaslighting, incel, and techlash, toxic wavers between a warning and a diagnostics of harm. Its meaning has migrated from immediate reference to poisonous chemicals, waste dumps, air, water, and soil pollution, acid rain, food contamination, and bad stuff in your body, to metaphorical memes such as toxic social environment, toxic financial assets, toxic data, toxic personality, and toxic masculinity. Generic slang for misogyny, machismo, bullying, male entitlement, or simply masculinity. Toxic derives from the Greek toxikon pharmakon, signifying bow or weapon. Here, the poison at the tip of the arrow, through part-whole substitution, produces a mind meld of toxin and weapon, of phallic privilege and polluting shaft. Accordingly, the antidote, trigger warning, becomes interchangeable with toxicity alert, itself a precondition of a space that is safe because it is protected against power abuse, gender harming, and other offenses against dignity of person. When we get to the term safe space, allusions to toxicity become even more freighted. The main reason, I think, is because safe space collapses conflicting narratives of self-defense, shored up by these logics of property in the person and what we call in America castle laws. Is everyone familiar with that? It means your home is your castle and you have a right to shoot anyone who tries to come into your castle. It's called castle laws. So there's this collapsing of self-defense, castle laws, environmental protection dependent on delimitations of non-toxic environments, and self-preservation, which is linked to logics of vaccination, immunization, and homeopathy, and more broadly, the ideal of staying safe as a steady state, as if there could be some way you could always be safe. This leaching of vocabulary, which strangely mimics the seepage and dissemination of toxic antigens, poses a capital translation problem within English itself. And this is something that interests me too. It's not just translation across languages, it's within English itself. Because it is in American parlance that reinforces connections between the language of private self-interest, or as Jane Elliott puts it, life interest, whereby interest is earned on self or on individual social value by means of self-protection, and the language of hazard-free spaces modeled on safety locks, safe rooms, nuclear fallout shelters, gated communities, detox centers, oxygen chambers, and oxygen tanks, like the kind dragged around by the heroine of Todd Haynes' movie, Safe. Here she is in her house getting kind of freaked out by all of the antibodies that are just in the home, and she ends up wandering around with an oxygen tank in a completely sealed space, unable to have any relationship with anyone. I call this is Frankenlife. These associations, branded as indirect causes of social phobia, declining sperm counts, or the sex recession, that's another nice term, stand in sharp contrast to the idea of a safe house, and I take this very seriously, as space of asylum or shelter where people go to repair in the wake of illness and trauma. Safe houses, let's remember, have a history in abolitionism as way stations for runaway slaves, in the history of feminism as shelters for battered women. Safe harbor designates spaces of asylum for refugees fleeing persecution and precarity. The offices of therapists and analysts are considered safe by dint of a professional ethic of no blame, no shame. And in sex play, safe words signal stop. In the arena of micropolitics, safety zones denote areas detoxified of clouds of bad affect. That's my last book coming in. I'm sorry, I won't put that too much on you. Now, here I conclude. In Claudia Rankine's Citizen, these safe spaces are missing in these positive ones, and in their stead is a world whose climate controls are set to atmospheres of social toxicity, inventorying sonic undertones of voice and innuendos of diction. There are lines like, "Did I hear what I think I heard?" Or there are these gazes. And here's another line, "You are not the only viewer who thought it," meaning Serena Williams's body, "was getting in the way of umpire Alvis's sightline." And then the zoning of bodies in space. And she takes inspiration from Glenn Ligon's work when she uses the phrase graphite against a sharp white background. This is an image included in the book. Each of these phrases appears in a section devoted to the African-American tennis star Serena Williams, her legendary outbursts, which we saw again recently, against umpires Mariana Alves and Eva Asdekari over calls that disqualified her game, are projected against a backdrop of micro-racism, slights, and injurious, you could call them traumas with a small t. Williams's incongruous body on the courts of Wimbledon and Indian Wells attests to a battle for rightful presence in a world that calls it wrongful. Forget all that, the world says. The world's had a lot of practice. Feelings are what create a person, something unwilling, something wild, vandalizing whatever the skull holds. Those sensations form a someone. The headaches begin then. Don't wear sunglasses in the house, the world says. As the world's aggressions are scored, as Serena smashes her racket, the pressure mounts to re-legislate ordinary spaces of social interaction, to make them, if not safe, then safer. But by what law? What supervisory structure remediates structural racism and sexism? What process of, you could almost call it detranslation, might ensure that citizens' narrator would not overhear, and this is a quote from the text, a man standing outside a conference room confide to his colleague that, quote, "Being around black people is like watching a foreign film without translation." Rankine's Citizen reveals the extent to which the safety net, like the question of whose safety is at stake in the landscape of securable persons, calls forth a new critique of judgment, starting with the recognition that in place of universal markers of equivalence among basic terms and conditions of justice, there is simply labor, the Sisyphean task of translating toward equality and of turning over concept metaphors of triggering, toxicity, and safe space, among others, that project environments against which there exists, as yet, really no defense. Thank you.
Safe spaces, which are also controlled spaces compared to, if you think about Foucault and sexual liberation. This idea that you quoted at the beginning and the end of rightful presence, is this a possible alternative? Because rightful presence would then also be somehow legally codified, but not in terms of the space, the location, the site, but differently. Would you say that would be one way to begin to what you called thinking towards translating
Equality.
Mm-hmm.
Or translating justice. Yeah. I think part of the play on rightful and wrongful, or rightness, on one level gets me into some of the oldest questions around what is it to, and people have used this, to justice something. And there are two different ways to answer this question. One is that we have, in the practice of translation, but also in the law, there have to be measures or standards of equivalence. Yeah. And I'm interested in what happens when you introduce terms that don't fit very well in that, like political inequality. It says, oh, no, that's not about this. That's a different discourse. It's even when you're thinking about aesthetic justice, Flaubert's Le Mot Juste. What is it that's just about it? That has a kind of aesthetic measure or design or structural balance, right? A kind of scales of balance idea. All of this depends on economies of equivalence. And rightful presence basically comes along and says, we don't accept that norm of equivalence. And the concrete example would be that a law that doesn't take account of forms of exclusion would have to be pressured. Now, it's part of what I tried to articulate is just how difficult this is in practice. Because, and the thing that we're constantly battling is, does this mean more institutional intrusion? Yeah. Does this mean the legalization of and a kind of renorming of interactions where anything that could count as, and this is a very controversial and difficult term, I'm trying actually to avoid it more and more, but that microaggressions would be legislated. Someone comes along and says, I didn't like the way you looked at me, and would there be then legal redress? Yeah. Well, there already is.
There is.
There is.
I mean, you have given us the example with how consent has been defined and reclassified according to things that actually have nothing to do with consent, imaginatively, enthusiastically. That's the flip side of trying to regulate that concept.
Yes, exactly.
And so rightful presence would be calling into question.
I think rightful presence would say, yes, all of these things are really difficult. All of these things are producing immense discomfort at the moment, in the office, in the classroom, in social interactions. But guess what? That's where we are. This is, in a sense, the little place of little civil wars that are happening. And the problem is that you can say, well, I'm not going to deal with that. But you have no choice. We're there.
Yeah. Okay, you are here. Please, I invite you to comment or ask Emily questions. I believe we have a microphone in the room. We do. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm Susan Zieger. I'm a fellow at the Max Planck Institute. I wanted to ask about your use of the term infrastructure and also structure to try to describe some of these kind of shifting and overlapping spaces between maybe like institutions, but also affective experience. And you talked about it failing as well, because we're in this strange, uncharted territory. And so I was wondering, if you could just sort of say more about the choice of those terms and the kinds of work that they're helping you do as you make your argument.
Yeah, I'm sort of referencing some of the architects in the room who are fully aware of Keller Easterling's work called Extra Statecraft, on the whole question of infrastructure, which came out a while ago now. But one thing that this book did was it allowed us to see tiny structures, whether they are, guardrails on highways or little bits of mesh that are covering bits of ceiling that are falling down, or really anything that is part of a built environment that before was often viewed just passively as not having any political content whatsoever. And so that's one thing, is the sort of expansion of the idea of infrastructure as a political concept, right? That it went from being the stuff on the ground, some of which is used for protection against accidents or hazards, to something that then crosses over, as you say, into affect and the social. So, somebody decides that there will be open cubicles, and that certain groups will be working in close proximity, but for certain people that's too near. That's very uncomfortable. For others, it will create a new kind of community and sink in a workspace. And so these would be things like a desk, the placement of a desk, or the amount of inches between something, or whether you have, say, plexiglass barriers. I mean, there's really now cases where prison architecture that was used for visitors going to on a visiting day to see a prisoner, that there's a debate about whether that should be introduced into certain kinds of campus spaces for office hours, or that there would be a kind of panoptical architecture in order to guarantee safety. And the thing is that this goes all over the political spectrum, because, as we know, sometimes it's people on the left who feel vulnerable, who are pushing for institutions to take safety measures. I just got something on my, going through the NYU email a few days ago, called Safe Zone Training. And it's not to do with nuclear fallout shelters. It's to do with new forms of social conditioning. And it's for people coming out of a sort of emancipatory ways of life that it's obviously extremely confusing. But I think I'm coming to the conclusion that you have to live with contradictions all the time. It's not resolvable. As far as I can see, it's not resolvable. So one of the things I'm interested in is how to talk about it, because what happens is that it becomes one side or the other, and it becomes all or nothing. And instead of seeing that, in fact, there's all kinds of stuff happening where something that was invented for very material practices, or, I know your work is on logistics and how that travels around. Logistics is part of this, right? That would be a mediating, something that works both for material infrastructure and for the law, right? For legislating affect, legislating social relations.
Thank you. You should be on the Supreme Court. No, honestly, because I'm a lawyer, and what you are talking about is the difficulty of defining words and meanings, and since our societies globally more and more mix, and communication is ongoing and mixing, we need a constant discussion on these meanings, because the codes of those talking to each other are not as they were 100 years ago, not as clear-cut by borders. And taking down the borders means more talking to come to a new contract. Mm-hmm. And the question is that what you are telling us?
That's what you...
Yes, I think that one area, I mean, I had some political philosophy background, and I've always been utterly fascinated by sexual contract and social contract. It's been like one of the long-standing. I don't have a training in the law, but it's something that I think comes back now in a way. You know, there's always been experts who work on this, but it's been a bit removed from some of the campus security debates, for example. And there are some thinkers who are wading into this, but a lot of times they have too much skin in one game. Someone like Jeannie Suk, for example, or the Harvard women who, you know, have contested some of the attempts to clumsily create laws to protect against harassment that are a little more subtle than what was already there. But it's as if they don't see that these are philosophical questions. For me, what is always fascinating is, you know, using, and I have a habit of always overhearing what's in language. It plays on different levels. So I think, well, maybe that's my intervention, right? I'm not going to be a proper legal theorist, but I am hearing what the language is doing, and it's the way it travels. And what Americans really rarely do, unless they're specialists, is think at all about the rest of the world. And in terms of how these things don't translate, they will come. What I've heard over and over again is someone will just sort of talk to somebody in Germany or in anywhere, and they'll talk about trigger warning, and what are you talking about? You know, even if you explain it, it doesn't make sense in those contexts. But there's this assumption that this is how we're thinking about this. Well, you know, we all read articles online constantly, so this isn't just staying in America, this is traveling. All of this is traveling, and it's generating other kinds of debates. So it's been interesting to touch the tip of the iceberg on German law around this. It's different. And a lot is very slow in coming, and I don't say that because with an absolute horizon of progress, look at the regressions that we're seeing. But that it does sometimes surprise me that the first reaction of many Germans is, no, we don't do that here.
I don't think. I mean, it depends on where you are, but there are certain contexts in which it is, in which the entire vocabulary has been adopted, not adapted, adopted, and reproduced. That it does exist, not everywhere, but then you could also argue that is because sexism is a bit more rampant in the German academy than it was in the American, right? There are fewer women around. It's a very different story, right? Anyway, more questions. Tim Walters.
The moderator knows me. I'm Tim Walters. I'm not sure who or what I am, but some people think I'm a privacy expert. And don't get me started about privacy and safe space, in fact. So to the irritation of the moderator, I have two questions, but I think one of them you've already answered, and that is, you started out by saying, when you introduce safe space, as if there's any place that's totally safe and always safe. And so my question would have been, is the notion of safe space in some deep sense, or maybe in some very superficial and obvious sense, or both, antithetical to the notion of and the practice of living together and social existence and community and what Nancy calls existence as being together and so forth? And I think your answer to that is, and so you can just tell me if I'm wrong, is that, as you said, it's irresolvable. It's yes, both, right? Yes, they are antithetical, but big deal. You need to work with it, right? So the other thing I wanted to ask you is, applying some of this, and I'm sure you've thought about this, and you may have even said some of it tonight, to language and languages themselves. So every language, in order to exist, is constantly going through a process of translation with corruption by other languages. And then there is, of course, in every language, most stereotypically, famously, the French, whether in France or in French Canadians, this resistance to the corruption of the language. But you've been here long enough to also see this, I would call it mania, about Fremdwörter invading Germany, right? And then, you know, the newspaper will take a stand and essentially create a safe space. We're going to make sure, if we use an English term, we're going to immediately translate it into a German equivalent and so forth. We're going to resist this toxicity and so forth. Is that an aspect of it as well?
I hadn't thought about these debates, which I have been following a bit with Liz around gender Sternchen and, you know, that in a sense it's trying to create a safe space of language. I mean, the whole Académie Française. But of course, when you think about safe for whom, these are erecting elite barriers around certain kinds of usage. The whole story in France is so interesting because it started in the French Revolution as a way of enfranchising people who didn't have French, it was called peasants into Frenchmen. And they went out, and there were squadrons of people who went out to introduce grammar and standardize the language, and there was language policing. But then, of course, it becomes this, far from being anything democratizing, it becomes this way of keeping out. But I think to answer your question would be to really point to another point, which is that you've just introduced another notion of safeness, which I hadn't thought about. And tracking this is really interesting. Something has happened in terms of an epistemic shift when you think about keeping languages away from translation or keeping them pure. You know, this is an old idea, right? That keeping ethnic identity clean and keeping language homogeneous. This is an old idea, but the idea of introducing now with this other notion of safety, of how the patrolling and the barriers are the new technologies for that, whether it's sometimes triggering things in the press, which now are a different language too. I mean, there's media trolling about it as opposed to just a debate. And if it gets mixed up with all kinds of politics of immigration.
Yeah.
One last question. Arndt Wedemeyer.
I wish I could really boil it down to one question, but there's so many aspects that one needs to raise. I think one concerns the entire dimension of liability and the way it interferes in these. But I'm struck by just how much fun it is to listen to you, give an account of all these intricate webs of untranslatability that structure these shifts. And these are shifts. These are, I think, are very significant and important shifts. And of course, I feel this kind of delight over the subtlety of these shifts, right? Which are usually in the public sphere are registered as violent, or there's usually some panic attached to these. You know, oh my God, what is happening? How are we going to ever procreate again? And you know, all these things about the imminent demise of the species because it can't handle its sexuality. But the joy of taking apart these minute untranslatabilities and minute works of translation and language and so on. But that makes me ask about, it's not just that you want to contribute as a philologist, but it feels like you feel the philologist has a particular kind of affinity because of the subtlety of the work that is going on in these debates. So that makes me wonder about what kind of philology are we practicing? Is there a kind of natural affinity of certain conceptions of philology to the dimension of sensitivity, of subtlety, of vulnerability, of a kind of relationship to artifacts that is almost a kind of attunement or something, right? So I'm asking, what goes into our conception of philology that we can come to the point where we say, oh, before we have to adjudicate anything, which we don't have to do as philologists, let's just first revel in the delight of all the stuff that's going on there. Right? Maybe the follow-up question would be whether you would be inclined to derive from that some sort of generalized ethics of vulnerability, like Judith Butler would try, where sociality or it's a kind of communitarianism of vulnerability. Whether you would want to go that way.
I'm not sure I want to just join that bandwagon, though I don't have a problem with it. It's more that I'm interested in, honestly, like, what is it to be in those places? It's more of a modes of existence question that is both social and self. What? So I think these things are all connected, and I think people who work in the law see safety in a more positivist way. But then philology, when it was really good, always was linked to philosophy. It wasn't just a positive science for tracking how certain cognates connect or find each other across languages or don't. It was. And I keep coming back to this, maybe because there's so much interesting work in sound studies now. But philology is a way of overhearing. So a lot of people have ears that hear puns or double entendres or homonyms, and when you do multiple languages, you hear it's like yeah, and instead of I trust that echo chamber. I know that echo chamber, that multilingual echo chamber, even if I'm not good at the language, I'm open. And so even when it's a false friend or it doesn't work, that to me is a place to start. It's an Ansatzpunkt. And the way that Rankine takes ordinary speech and language and terms that you, like safety lock, and turns it into not just something with a certain philosophical resonance for me, but a kind of philosophy. I hear a term, and part of my whole project has been, I think I talked about this at the Freie Universität, so apologies to anyone who was there, but it's about taking terms that have no standing philosophically or in the law. They can be small parts of speech, they can be syntactic terms, but they activate situationally, and they become performative. And it's often when languages come up against each other or fail to translate, and we've all had that experience of, you try this out and it bombs, you've just said the wrong, you got it wrong. But that's kind of, often you got it wrong for a reason. You heard something else, and I trust those moments to get me out of the groove. I'm not going to get into my little rant here, but I get tired of criticism that repeats and has a pressure to stay away from the resonances of other languages, that wants me, and if you're brought up in the US system, to stay plain English and to stay monolingual and to not introduce terms from French. And, you're really you're told to avoid Latinate expression. And I'm like, why? That's the best thing ever, But there's such a value placed on, the term that never misfires, the term that is direct discourse, as if somehow there was such a suspicion of anything that wasn't 100% transparent and accessible. And I just don't think sociality works that way. I think community really, even if it's not some ideal, it's operative through language in ways that you don't get through just through normal trainings. So anyway.
I think that was a lovely way to end. We thank you again.